The first time I saw the river, I stood still for nearly 10 minutes just listening. It wasn't grand or roaring. It meandered quietly through the back end of the property, brushing reeds and rocks like a whisper from an old friend. After 24 years in the military, I didn't think I'd find a place that could hush the noise in my head. But this river did. The house wasn't much. A single-story ranch-style faded siding, stubborn plumbing. But I wasn't looking for granite countertops or double vanities. I was looking for solitude and the sound of water. The property sat on the edge of a development called Silverback Ridge. Newer homes, big garages, identical mailboxes, the kind of place where everything smelled like mulch and regulation. But my lot technically wasn't part of the HOA. I double-checked the property lines on the deed 3 times before buying. I even paid a land use lawyer to confirm. Outside their jurisdiction, she said, handing me a highlighted map. You're on your own land, Mr. Dwyer. That's all I wanted, just to be left alone. For the first year, they mostly did. I kept my yard tidy, didn't blast music, didn't let the old Ford idle too long in the mornings. I made small talk at the mailbox and even donated to their Easter egg fundraiser. Their president, a tall pressed man named Greg Harland, dropped off a thank you card with a printed signature. No return address, of course, but I started to notice something around the 15-month mark. New construction signs, surveyor stakes near the riverbank, bright orange paint dots along trees that stood on my side of the line. At first, I assumed they were clearing brush for fire safety. California had burned brutally the year before, but then I saw the backhoe, 3 of them, sitting like yellow scarabs behind a chain-link fence that hadn't been there last week, and in front of them, a white banner stretched between metal poles. Future site of Silverback Ridge Riverwalk and Community Reflection Garden. My stomach dropped. The Riverwalk, and on whose river? I drove straight to the HOA office. The temporary trailer they used for meetings sat behind the tennis courts, air conditioning roaring like a jet engine. Inside, the air was thick with fake lemon cleaner, and the kind of silence that meant you'd walked into a room not meant for you. Karen Riston, their vice president, was behind the desk, her red blazer glowing under fluorescent lights. She looked up without smiling. Yes? I told her about the sign, about the equipment near the river, about my deed. She opened a file drawer without asking and pulled a glossy flyer from a stack. Phase 3 of Silverback Ridge expansion, she said, handing it to me. We're rerouting a segment of the creek to optimize the reflection path and reduce erosion near the community lots. I didn't even try to hide the disbelief on my face. You're rerouting the river? She blinked. A shallow unmanaged tributary. Yes, I leaned in. That unmanaged tributary is mapped by the county, and the flow line runs through my deed parcel. She frowned but didn't blink. Then I suggest you bring that up at the next HOA meeting. I did more than that. I spent the next week pulling records, county plat maps, aerial surveys. I called an old friend from the Army Corps of Engineers and sent him drone footage of the construction site. He replied in 3 words. That's not legal. I went to the meeting early, sat in the front row with a 3-ring binder full of maps and photos. Greg Harland called the session to order, read off agenda items like a man announcing the weather, and when I raised my hand, he smiled stiffly and said, "Public comments at the end, please." By the time they let me speak, half the room was yawning. I held up the binder anyway. You're digging into private property, I said, and you're redirecting a regulated waterway without permits. A few heads turned. Someone in the back whispered, but Greg's face didn't move. Mr. Dwyer, he said, we've consulted with an environmental contractor. This project has been thoroughly reviewed. By who? I asked. You don't have county approval. You don't have Army Corps review. Hell, you don't even have runoff modeling. He shrugged. It's a beautification initiative. I laughed, short, hard, and bitter. It's a disaster waiting to happen. That was the night everything changed. Within a week, they started bringing in concrete culverts and grading equipment. A shallow trench curved like a snake around the rear fence of my lot. They moved fast, too fast for a project that hadn't even passed environmental review. They tore down 3 trees that were older than the neighborhood itself. They laid gravel and bent the river's flow with sandbags and optimism. And every evening I stood by my back porch and watched water struggle to obey them. Something in me started to twist. It wasn't just the river they were harming. It was everything I'd built my quiet life around. They were rearranging nature for aesthetics, for resale value, for community vision. But rivers don't take orders, and I knew that better than anyone. I'd seen what happened when engineers got arrogant with water. Back in 2003, I'd been stationed near a dam project in Iraq. The upstream gates jammed during a flash flood. Locals warned us for days. Our officers brushed it off. When the levee broke, it didn't ask who wore the uniform. It drowned men just the same. I lost 3 of my unit that night, and a translator I'd come to think of as a brother. So no, I wasn't going to let this HOA play God with a river I now called neighbor. The sound of water that had once calmed me now whispered a warning. And this time I was ready to listen. I knew what a mistake looked like before it became a disaster. You learn that in combat zones. How to smell the moment something's about to go wrong, long before it makes noise. And when the first excavator dipped its steel claw into the side of the riverbank, that smell returned. But this time I wasn't halfway across the world. This time it was 50 yards from my porch. The morning they began tearing up the bank was crisp and cloudless. A Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished patching a corner of the barn roof and was enjoying a rare cup of coffee. I hadn't reheated twice, heard the engines before I saw them. 3 diesel machines chugging like lazy beasts moving in tandem down the gravel access road behind the HOA clubhouse. They stopped right where the natural bend of the river formed a wide curve, kind of place I'd seen herons nest every spring and deer wade through in the summer. By the time I walked over to the fence line, 2 men in neon vests were already laying out spray paint and string markers. One waved at me. The other avoided eye contact. I leaned over the fence. "You fellas got a permit for this?" The one who'd waved, maybe late 20s, hard hat a little too new, called back, "We're under HOA contract. You'll need to talk to the board." "I have," I said, folding my arms. "They said this area was community maintained." "Funny, because it's on my deed." The guy shrugged. "We're just the crew, sir. We don't deal with legal lines. That's the trouble with these projects. No one's ever responsible. Not the board, not the contractor, not the subcontractor. It's always someone else. Always a higher-up with a signature somewhere just out of reach. So I did what they didn't expect. I started documenting. By noon, I had photos from 4 angles, time-stamped, geotagged. I launched my drone and recorded high-res video of the heavy machinery scooping into the water's edge, dumping sediment into a makeshift berm that jutted toward the HOA tennis courts like a poorly planned beaver dam. Then I drove straight to the county planning office. To their credit, the receptionist didn't brush me off. A woman named Leanne with reading glasses and a thick stack of environmental code books sat me down and opened up a digital map overlay of the Silverback Ridge development. When I showed her my footage and pointed out the rerouted path of the creek, her lips thinned into a tight line. "This shouldn't be happening," she muttered. "No permit?" I asked. "Not for waterway diversion, and certainly not that close to a private parcel." She scribbled something on a sticky note, then said, "I'll elevate this. You'll want to speak to Water Resources. I'll flag the file." I thanked her, left a thumb drive with copies of the footage, and walked out the door feeling a small flicker of hope. But hope is a fragile thing around an HOA, because 2 days later, when I returned home from a supply run into town, I found something that sent a different flicker through my spine. A plastic notice zip-tied to my mailbox. Unapproved structure, compliance notice. It referred to my chicken coop, a coop that had stood untouched and uncomplained about for 3 years. According to the notice, I was in violation of community aesthetic standards, and it came with a fine, $75, escalating weekly. I marched straight to the HOA office. The same trailer, the same fake lemon smell. Karen Riston again behind the desk, reading a thick binder as if she were a judge presiding over the fates of men. "This is harassment," I said, throwing the notice onto the counter. She looked up slowly, as if the weight of my accusation was merely a passing breeze. "You are within visible proximity of HOA properties," she said. "Your chicken enclosure violates the view standards." I pointed toward the direction of my land. "That coop's been there since I moved in. You've had no problem until now." She tilted her head. Perhaps it was overlooked. I saw it then, clear as a tactical maneuver. They were retaliating. My complaint to the county had rattled someone's cage, and now they were trying to teach me a lesson. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a legal pad mapping out every step I'd taken so far. Filing dates, photos, survey lines. I called my old buddy Sam, former city inspector, now retired and cranky as hell, and told him what was happening. "You've got them scared," he said. "They wouldn't come after your coup unless they knew they screwed up." "They've got more lawyers than I do," Sam chuckled. "Maybe, but they don't have the river on their side." His words stuck with me. Because the truth was, even if the county stalled, even if the HOA kept playing legal games, the river didn't care about committees or fines. It only cared about flow and force. And if you messed with it without knowing what you were doing, it always found a way to remind you. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of the rerouted channel and took more video. They'd installed metal culverts, narrow ones far too shallow for spring runoff. Worse, they'd undercut part of the western bank, removing root structures that had held it stable for decades. Any hydrologist could tell you what that meant. Come rain, and it would give way. Come flood, and the culverts would bottleneck. But they wouldn't listen to warnings. So I did what they couldn't stop. I made a copy of everything. I filed a formal report with the state water board. I sent another drone video to the local newspaper with a short note. Silverback Ridge. HOA is rerouting natural waterways without permit or engineering review. Public risk imminent. They didn't publish it, but they didn't ignore it either, because 3 days later, a car I didn't recognize rolled up my driveway. 2 people stepped out, clipboards in hand, state badges on their belts. They weren't smiling, and neither was I. The inspectors from the State Water Resources Control Board introduced themselves as Marcus Lynn and Marisol Vega. Both were polite, but carried the unmistakable air of people who had seen enough bureaucratic cover-ups to read the signs from a mile away. Marcus was quiet, meticulous, early 40s. Marisol was sharper, maybe mid-30s, with a face that didn't flinch when I mentioned the HOA's name. I walked them down to the riverbank and pointed out everything. The new trench line, the misaligned culverts, the sediment runoff pooling unnaturally on the west side. I showed them the drone footage, the county plat, and the photos I printed and arranged in chronological order like a crime scene wall. Marisol nodded slowly. No mitigation barriers, no turbidity control. This is textbook violation. Marcus traced the bend of the river with his eyes. This whole segment was natural flow for decades, I said. Check the satellite maps going back to '92. They didn't just touch it, they moved it. Marisol looked at me. And they didn't serve you a notice of intention to alter? I laughed bitterly. They served me a violation for my chicken coop. She didn't laugh. Neither did Marcus. They took water samples, soil readings, and several pictures with a high-powered lens I'd never seen outside of military use. Before they left, Marisol turned to me and said, though they'll try to claim it was minor grading or erosion prevention. But this isn't erosion, this is redirection. And that means jurisdiction. Then what happens now? We write the report, she said. We escalate. I wanted to feel victorious, but I knew better. Bureaucracy doesn't move on feeling. It moves on paper, procedure, and pressure. And the HOA had built itself into something more than a neighborhood association. They held community grants, funded the mayor's re-election picnic, and had 3 former city council members on the advisory board. That's what you call insulation. And insulation makes people bold. That boldness was on full display the next week when I received a new notice in the mail. Unpermitted surveillance activity. Cease and desist. Apparently someone on the board had submitted a complaint to the county that I was droning over protected community easements without authorization. The notice even referenced potential privacy violations and cited vague local codes about aerial photography. It was a bluff, but a clever one. They wanted to rattle me, push me to make a mistake, get aggressive, get careless. I didn't. Instead, I documented that too, but the real slap in the face came during the next HOA meeting. I went, of course, sat in the same front row. No binder this time, just my hands folded in my lap, listening. Karen Riston, as always, was perched at the head of the room like a queen behind a folding table throne. She wore a different red blazer this time, but the same smirk. We're proud to report progress on the Riverwalk project, she announced, which is already increasing property value forecasts by 14%. Applause. Light scattered, but applause. One man, Richard Blevins, a retiree whose house sat closest to the newly cut trench, raised his hand. Is it true the state is investigating? Karen smiled tight and rehearsed. There's always routine review with projects of this size, but we're in full compliance. That was a lie. I stood up. Not loud, not dramatic. Just stood. They're not reviewing. They're investigating, I said. Because what you've done here is illegal. Karen didn't blink. Mr. Dwyer, this portion of the meeting is for community updates, not personal grievances. I didn't sit. Tell them about the soil samples, about the missing permits, about the endangered willow root system you ripped out to make room for your picnic benches. Now people were turning in their seats. You're a liar, Karen, I said. And when that storm hits, and it will, you'll answer for the damage. She didn't flinch, but someone else did. A man sitting 3 rows behind me, a younger homeowner I didn't recognize, stood slowly and said, Is that true about the storm? Karen turned toward him like a cobra. Please take your seat. But he didn't. Because my daughter plays down by that river. And if what he's saying is even half right, Karen's voice sharpened. Mr. Reinhardt, you are out of order. But the room had shifted. I saw it in their eyes. Doubt. Just a flicker. But it was enough. I left before they could vote on the next community dog park mural. But I knew I'd planted something. Not just fear, curiosity. And curiosity is HOA kryptonite. That night, the rain started. Not heavy, not yet, but steady. The kind of slow, persistent rain that soaked the soil just enough to loosen its grip. I knew the real storm was coming that weekend. The Weather Service had issued a watch. Saturated ground, high winds, upstream swell. Perfect conditions for failure. I checked the trench again the next morning. The western edge had already begun to slump. Little rivulets of water ran down into the new path like fingers, searching for a throat. I took more photos. I sent them to Marisol. And I waited. The next day, I found a rock through my window wrapped in a note. We know what you're doing. Stop. No signature, no fingerprints. But I didn't need them, because I wasn't alone anymore. People were asking questions, whispering during HOA walks, calling the county, taking pictures. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the river had begun to move differently, and neither were they. The water was coming. It happened just before dawn. I'd been sleeping light, the way you do when your gut knows something's wrong, but your mind can't pin it down. A wind had picked up overnight, and the gutters chattered like teeth outside my bedroom window. Somewhere far off, a metallic clatter echoed through the trees, something too heavy to be wildlife, too rhythmic to be the storm. I threw on my boots and jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The beam cut through the mist hanging over the river, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind before something breaks. Then I saw the tracks, fresh, deep, leading from the HOA service road across the grass. At the edge of my lot, over the property line onto my land, I followed them like a hound. Mud-sucked impressions of backhoe tires unmistakable in their width and aggression. They didn't stop at the edge. They didn't hesitate. They drove straight through the cluster of cedar saplings I'd planted 2 years ago. 3 of them were crushed. A 4th bent low under its own weight like it was ashamed. I felt the fury rise in my chest, slow and hot. This wasn't just carelessness. This was a message. I kept going. By the time I reached the river's edge, the beam of my flashlight hit the glint of metal, an excavator arm half submerged in the soft soil still dripping water. 2 men stood nearby, one with a shovel, the other with a clipboard and a headlamp strapped to his forehead. They didn't see me at first. I raised my voice, low but sharp. You're on private land. Shut it down. Both of them startled. The one with the clipboard turned toward me, squinting against the light. Sir, this area is under active remediation. We've been authorized by the HOA. Authorized by the HOA doesn't mean squat on my deed parcel, I snapped. You crossed the legal boundary. You damaged my property. You're trespassing. He hesitated. The other man, younger, already backing away, muttered something about calling the supervisor. Good, I said. Tell him I have drone footage, time-stamped photos, and GPS logs of every inch you just tore up. The clipboard guy tried to recover. Look, we're just doing erosion stabilization. We thought this was still under community jurisdiction. I stepped forward, flashlight steady. You thought wrong. He shifted his weight like he was about to argue. I pulled out my phone and started recording. His mouth snapped shut. This is documented, I said. And if you so much as touch another root on my land, I will call the sheriff, file charges, and slap your company with a civil suit they'll choke on. They left. Not quickly. Not like scared kids, but with the stiff, embarrassed shuffle of men who knew they'd been caught red-handed. By the time their truck pulled away, I'd already emailed the footage to Marisol Vega at the water board and CC'd the county recorder's office. Then I pulled out the property stakes I'd been saving for years and slammed them into the ground one by one, all along the edge of the lot, big, white, and labeled in bold black letters, private property. Trespassing is a crime. The next day I got a call. Not from the HOA, not from the county. From a woman named Danielle Whitman, an investigative journalist from Channel 9 local news. I saw the drone footage you submitted, she said. And I've been following complaints filed against Silverback Ridge HOA. Can we talk? I invited her over. She brought a cameraman, a microphone, and more questions than I expected. Smart questions. Sharp. She wasn't there for fluff. She was after something real. I showed her the trench, the collapsed saplings, the footage of the equipment crossing into my lot. I walked her through the maps, the permit gaps, the state's involvement. When I showed her the rock through my window, her eyes hardened. We'll run this story, she said. They'll try to push back, but this matters. That night, her segment aired. Homeowner fights HOA over unauthorized river redirection. The images were clear. The story was tight. The voiceover pulled no punches. And for the first time in months, I felt the tide begin to shift. The calls started the next morning. 3 neighbors stopped by in person. One of them, Rachel Hunt, lived across the river in a townhouse that backed up against the diverted channel. Her back deck was already starting to slant, the soil underneath it eaten away by redirected current. They told us it was just landscaping, she said, eyes wide. But the water's moving faster now. It never used to flood here, and last night, my sump pump couldn't keep up. That made 5 of us now. 5 families with grievances, with stories, with proof. And still the rain came, steady, unrelenting. The kind that seeped into root systems, lifted gravel, and softened every defense man had tried to build against nature. The water in the channel had risen 6 inches overnight, and the trench the HOA had carved was beginning to bulge at the seams. I checked my mailbox at dusk. Another notice. This one was handwritten. You're making things worse for everyone. Stop stirring the pot. No signature, no return address, just like before. But they didn't understand something fundamental. I wasn't afraid of pot stirrers. I'd spent my life defusing bombs, watching for snipers, digging friends out of rubble. They thought I was just some grumpy old man with a property line and a grudge. They didn't know I was trained to hold the line until it broke, and it was about to break. Not just the channel, not just the soil, but everything they thought they controlled. The alerts came in waves, first from the local news, then from the weather service, and finally from my phone's emergency broadcast app, which chirped in the middle of the night like a bird warning of war. Flash flood watch in effect. Severe. Storm expected with 4 to 6 inches of rainfall over 36 hours. I'd read enough flood models to know what that meant. 6 inches of rain over already saturated ground wasn't just trouble. It was structural compromise. It was runoff volume increasing exponentially. It was erosion chewing away every inch of stability they thought they had. I was on my porch at 6 a.m., raincoat on, thermos in hand, watching the sky turn a dull, bruised gray. The clouds hung low like they were being pressed down from above. The river didn't make its usual soft babble. It sounded heavier, as if it too was holding its breath. I checked the trench. The water had already overtopped the gravel berm they'd installed. The culverts, those shiny, narrow tubes the HOA engineers had deemed sufficient for runoff, were practically invisible beneath the rising flow. I shot another drone video and texted it to Marisol Vega at the water board. Her reply came less than 5 minutes later. Get to high ground. This could get bad fast, but the HOA, they were planning a barbecue. No, I'm not kidding. A full-on Community Resilience Day gathering right in the clubhouse parking lot, with flyers posted to mailboxes and an email blast boasting bounce houses, catered brisket, and a ribbon cutting for the Riverwalk Garden's new gazebo. I showed the email to Rachel Hunt, who stopped by to borrow sandbags. Her eyes widened. They're still doing it, even with the warnings? Worse, I said. They're calling it a celebration of weathering adversity together. It would have been funny if it weren't criminal. I loaded up my ATV with sandbags and drove along my fence line, checking for weak spots. The back corner where they'd ripped out cedar roots had already sunk 2 inches. I reinforced it with gravel and tarped the vulnerable slope. Rachel and her husband came by to help. Then the Reinhardts. Even old man Blevins, with his arthritic knees, hobbled over and handed me a roll of plastic sheeting. A community was forming, just not the one the HOA had in mind. By late afternoon, the first real sheets of rain came down. No more drizzle, no more polite warning. The sky opened with fury and the Riverwalk barbecue was still on. I saw them setting up tents in the storm. Greg Harland in his white HOA windbreaker, Karen Riston with her red umbrella held like a royal scepter. Volunteers scrambled to keep things dry. Someone was trying to power a speaker system. Another was taping down a Silverback Strong banner to a gazebo that was less than 20 feet from the channel edge. From my porch, it looked surreal, like watching a wedding unfold on the deck of a sinking ship. At 4:45 p.m., I saw the first signs. The far bank of the channel, HOA territory, began to slump. Just a foot at first, a small section of sod disappearing into the water with a soft splash. I grabbed my camera. 5 minutes later, a 10-foot section caved in. The trench wasn't wide enough, the flow too fast, and all the water they tried to redirect with arrogance and half-baked engineering was now carving its own path, right under the clubhouse lawn. I sent the video to the local news station to Marisol to anyone who would listen. Then I got in my truck and drove to the HOA barbecue. They were still serving brisket when I arrived. Karen spotted me first. She smiled like she smelled something bad. Mr. Dwyer, I didn't expect to see you here. I nodded toward the trench. Might want to wrap up early. The river's not holding. Greg approached, jaw tight. You're trespassing. This is a community event. This is a warning, I said, handing him my phone with the live drone feed still rolling. You've got maybe an hour before that berm fails. 2 if you're lucky. There are children here. He didn't take the phone. Karen folded her arms. Your fear-mongering has gone far enough. A woman nearby holding a toddler turned toward us. She caught part of what I said and looked toward the river. Karen noticed her, and for just a second her mask slipped, but it was Greg who made the final mistake. He stepped closer to me and hissed, You're not part of this community, Dwyer, you never were, and when this is over you'll wish you moved years ago. Maybe, I said, stepping back, but I'll still have a house to move from. I turned, climbed back into my truck and drove home. The rain intensified and 30 minutes later, the drone caught it all. The entire eastern trench wall collapsed in on itself. A surge of water, dirt, and debris burst through the failed culverts, flooding the HOA's newly laid walking path. The gazebo tilted like a ship in a squall, before snapping sideways and floating like a giant tombstone into the center of the clubhouse lawn. A dozen homes along the eastern stretch of Silverback Ridge were in immediate danger. The water overtopped landscaping walls, poured into basements, and sent patio furniture cascading like flotsam into driveways. I called 911. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was already too late to stop the flood, but not too late to rescue the people in its path. And that's where things changed for all of us. I don't remember the sound of the river rising. I remember the absence of sound. It was the silence that pulled me off the couch, the kind of quiet that settles before something big, Thunder had been rolling all evening like distant cannons, but now it had gone mute. The rain paused. The wind held its breath. And that's when I knew. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the front door. There it was in a black wall. Not a wave, not a spray, just water where no water should be, moving fast and wide across the land like it was reclaiming something. I stood frozen for half a second before instinct kicked in. My boots splashed off the porch into 5 inches of rushing flood. The drone I'd left charging upstairs was already in my hand. I launched it from the porch rail and it shot into the sky, cutting through the mist and the dark like a hunting hawk. The live feed appeared on my screen, shaky from wind, but then it leveled, and I saw it. The berm had gone. Not just broken, not gone. The trench was now a river, and the river had chosen its own path, straight through the heart of the Silverback Ridge development. The new gazebo was floating like driftwood. Lawn chairs swirled in whirlpools around the clubhouse, and the new fitness center, that $200,000 construction project they'd bragged about in 6 separate newsletters, was already under 2 feet of water. But that wasn't what made me run. It was the lights in the homes, families, people still inside. The HOA had refused to send out a reverse 911 alert. Probably didn't want to admit liability, maybe didn't think it'd get this bad, but now it was here. And they weren't ready. I waded through the flood up to my knees, then to my thighs. By the time I reached my ATV in the barn, the water had already begun seeping under the door. I gunned the engine, took the back trail across the ridge, and headed straight for the Reinhardt's house first. They had a baby. I banged on the door, shouting over the sound of the rising current. Michael opened it, already holding his daughter. His wife was behind him with 2 duffel bags. "You saw it," he yelled. "I saw everything," I said. "Get to my place. It's elevated, reinforced. The barn's dry and stocked." They didn't hesitate. From there it was a blur. I moved house to house, cutting through flood water and shouting above the wind. Rachel Hunt's back porch had already collapsed, but she and her husband made it out through the front. The Blevins were on their roof when I arrived, wrapped in towels, shaking but alive. Each time I led them back to my barn, each time the water rose behind us. By 1:30 a.m., there were 13 people in my barn, 1 generator, 2 propane heaters, half a dozen cats, and every dry blanket I owned. The chickens in the coop outside clucked nervously, but I'd reinforced that structure myself. It would hold. We watched the news feed from my phone. Channel 9 had picked up the drone footage. My name was on the screen. Retired veteran rescues neighbors as HOA river project fails catastrophically. Karen Riston's name followed shortly after. So did Greg Harlan's. Both were unavailable for comment, but the story was out. The visuals undeniable. People were posting their own footage to social media, videos of basement filling in seconds, SUVs floating away, fences collapsing. The HOA had diverted a river, and the river had returned the favor. At 3 in the morning, the last family arrived on foot, soaked and shivering. A man and his teenage son who'd lived in one of the new town homes. Their house had cracked at the foundation. They didn't ask questions, just huddled with the others as I handed them towels and pointed to the corner with the space heaters. Someone said, "God bless you." I just nodded. This wasn't heroism. This was duty. The kind of thing drilled into me in the service. You protect people even if they didn't vote for you, even if they find your chicken coop, even if they threw a rock through your window, because this wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about truth. And truth, like water, always finds a way. I didn't sleep. I walked the perimeter of the barn every hour, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. Not because I expected violence, but because I knew how desperate people could get when they lost everything and still had their pride. Just before dawn, I checked the drone again. The clubhouse had collapsed. All of its roof sunk, supports mangled, a twisted mess of plywood and pipe. The tennis courts were under 4 feet of water. The pool had overflown, carrying patio umbrellas halfway down the street. And the eastern row of town homes, Karen Street, was dark. The news report confirmed it an hour later. Multiple homes destroyed, show under investigation, state and county emergency declarations enacted, and then a knock at the barn door. I opened it, shotgun lowered but ready. It was Karen, hair-drenched, red blazer clinging to her like a soaked flag of surrender. Surrender. Behind her, Greg, mud-splattered, pale, holding a backpack above his head like it was sacred. They looked at me. No words, just exhaustion. I stepped aside. No triumph, no gloating, just gravity. "Inside," I said. And they entered. The moment Karen crossed the threshold, the barn went quiet. She stopped just inside, water trailing behind her like guilt, her red blazer clinging in tatters, her hair limp, her expression unreadable. Greg followed closely behind, avoiding every eye in the room. He looked less like a man in charge and more like a man unmade. Shirt half torn, shoes mismatched, fingers trembling with adrenaline or shame. Maybe both. No one spoke, not at first. Then Rachel stood. "You have a lot of nerve," she said, voice low and firm. "You called me dramatic when I told you the retaining wall was sinking." Karen didn't answer. Michael Reinhardt's wife wrapped their baby tighter in a blanket and turned away. The child had stopped crying hours ago, exhausted by the noise, the cold, and the chaos. I watched Greg's eyes flick toward the infant, then away, as if he couldn't bear to acknowledge the consequences of his choices made real. I didn't say anything, not yet. I simply pointed to the empty corner where the last cot sat, folded neatly with a dry wool blanket on top. Karen hesitated, but Greg moved forward first, muttering a hollow, "Thank you." No one said, "You're welcome." By morning, the barn held 22 people, families, elderly couples, kids. Some had lost entire homes, others just power or safe access. The HOA clubhouse was gone. The development's main entrance road was submerged under 3 feet of fast-moving runoff, impassable to emergency vehicles. We'd become an island surrounded not by war but by water. I brewed coffee from an old camping percolator on my propane burner and passed around mugs one at a time. Nobody talked much. The air buzzed with exhaustion and unspoken questions. In the morning, the helicopters arrived. Local fire rescue, a news crew. Then, to my surprise, the State Water Board's environmental response team. 2 trucks and a Zodiac boat loaded with equipment. They couldn't get through the main road, so they launched from a neighbor's backyard. Marisol Vega was the first off the boat. Her boots sank into the mud, her ponytail soaked with drizzle, but she moved like she was born in this kind of mess. Behind her, Marcus Lynn carried a waterproof case and a folded tripod. They surveyed the damage quickly. I walked them around the perimeter of the flooded HOA property using my ATV, avoiding unstable ground and sunken driveways. I showed them where the culverts had collapsed, where the trench had cut deeper overnight, and where a full 15 feet of the bank had vanished beneath the flow. Did they have an engineer sign off on this? Marisol asked half to herself. They had a landscaper, I replied. She swore under her breath. When we returned to the barn, Karen tried to intercept us. "I'd like to clarify," she began, but Marisol held up a hand. "Save it. We're not here for spin." Greg stood behind her, jaw clenched. "We didn't mean for it to get this bad." "You meant to divert a waterway without a permit," Marisol said. "You meant to ignore environmental protocol. You meant to build a vanity project with zero engineering review. You meant all of it, Mr. Harland." He said nothing. Inside the barn, people huddled around phones as news reports trickled in. Helicopter footage showed what was left of the Riverwalk project. Washed-out paths, collapsed retaining walls, twisted metal where the fitness center used to stand. The local paper ran a headline that said it all. On Silverback Ridge, HOA faces environmental disaster after illegal river diversion. Beneath it, a photo of the channel my drone shot, stamped with my name in the corner. I didn't care about the credit. I cared that the truth was finally visible to everyone. By noon, FEMA representatives were on site. They asked to use the barn as a temporary shelter. I agreed. They set up cots and distributed water bottles and heat blankets. A mobile medic unit began checking blood pressure, wounds, and mild hypothermia cases. That afternoon, a sheriff's deputy arrived on a Zodiac and asked to speak to Karen and Greg privately. They stepped outside with him. 20 minutes later, only the deputy came back in. Karen and Greg didn't return. We found out later they were transported to the city to answer questions regarding reckless endangerment, illegal land alteration, and obstruction of environmental investigations. No one clapped. No one cheered. This wasn't a movie. It was real life, messy, wet, and still far from over. That night, the water finally began to recede. Not fast, not fully, but enough. The road became passable by late evening. National Guard trucks moved in. By then, my barn had been transformed into a coordination center, half shelter, half command post. I saw neighbors who'd never spoken to each other before sharing blankets, pouring coffee and fixing broken zippers on sleeping bags, and then something I didn't expect happened. Rachel stood up in front of everyone and cleared her throat. "Can I say something?" Heads turned. She looked at me. "Daniel Dwyer isn't just the reason we're safe tonight. He's the reason the truth came out. He saw what they were doing and stood up when the rest of us were too afraid to make noise." I opened my mouth to object, to say I'd just done what anyone should, but she held up a hand. "Don't, you warned them. You warned us and you paid for it." Michael stood beside her. "We think it's time the HOA ends, or at least changes." There were nods, then applause. Quiet at first, then building. I didn't stand. I didn't need to, because in that moment the real structure that had collapsed wasn't just a clubhouse or a gazebo. It was the illusion that they, Karen, Greg, the board, had control over us. The river had reminded them otherwise, and now so had we. When the sun rose the next morning, it didn't look like triumph. It looked like steam rising from soaked ground, like broken fence posts still lodged in mud, like debris draped across tree branches 10 feet off the ground. Silverback Ridge was no longer a pristine suburban jewel. It was a waterlogged war zone, and somehow I had become the guy people were coming to for answers. It started with Rachel. She knocked on my door, not the barn this time, but the house, and brought a clipboard. "We're organizing a community task force," she said. "Emergency recovery. We need you on it." I stared at her. "Rachel, I'm not looking to be the hero here. You already were." I looked away. The word hero never sat well with me. In my experience, most heroes were dead. The ones who survived usually carried more scars than stories. I didn't want anyone's gratitude. I just wanted my land back, my river quiet, and the damn HOA gone. But I nodded. "All right, I'll help." That same day, a sheriff's SUV pulled up outside. A young deputy named Rojos stepped out. I'd seen him at the HOA meetings once, sitting in the back, probably just there to monitor parking. He shook my hand. "Mr. Dwyer, I've got a formal statement request. County Council is building a case and they want you to testify." I testified against Karen and Greg, against the board, the HOA entity. There was possible criminal negligence, misuse of funds, environmental violations. The water board was pressing hard. They were using my footage as foundational evidence. So it was happening, the thing no one ever thought possible. The HOA wasn't just in trouble. It was on the edge of being dismantled. I agreed to testify, and the day I gave my deposition, I found myself sitting in a government office with a state prosecutor and 3 officials from the Department of Natural Resources, all asking questions like I was the expert. Did they consult any hydrologists? No. Did they present any water flow analysis or storm modeling? None that I saw. Did you personally warn them of the structural instability multiple times on the record in front of witnesses? And that was the thing they had all ignored. Not just one man, but one man with knowledge. I wasn't just some angry neighbor with a vendetta. I was a former military engineer with federal credentials and the documentation to prove what they did wrong down to the cubic foot per second. 2 days later, Channel 9 aired a follow-up segment, From Targeted Resident to Community Rescuer, the story of Daniel Dwyer. They ran footage from the drone again, cut with clips from interviews outside the courthouse. I barely watched it. I was too busy helping load sandbags with a team of neighbors to shore up the back end of the remaining dry homes. That night, a man I didn't recognize approached me while I was folding a tarp by the barn. He wore a windbreaker, mud-caked boots, and a clean-shaven face that said military or ex-military. He extended a hand. "Name's Keller. I work with the City Council's Emergency Planning Division." I shook his hand. "You're a hard guy to find," he said. "But I wanted to meet you. We've had an eye on Silverback Ridge for a while. Too many fast permits, too few inspections, figures." He hesitated, then said, "We'd like you to consider something. A formal advisory role, maybe even a seat on the Community Oversight Commission." I stared at him. "I'm not a politician." "We don't need politicians," he said. "We need people who tell the truth." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Because something had shifted. Not just in the HOA, not just in the neighborhood, but in me. For years I'd lived as quietly as possible, hoping silence would buy me peace. But silence hadn't protected my land. It hadn't kept the river from being twisted or the trees from being cut. All it had done was allow arrogance to grow louder. And now somehow that silence was gone, and I wasn't sure I wanted it back. By the end of that week, FEMA declared the area stabilized. The temporary shelters disbanded. Residents began cleanup, demolition, and repair. Most of the families who'd taken refuge in my barn stopped by one last time. Some with thank you cards, others with tears, many with offers of help I'd never asked for. One night, I found Greg sitting alone at the base of the broken gazebo, or what was left of it. He wasn't in cuffs anymore, at least not physically, but he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He stood when he saw me. I came to apologize. I didn't speak. I thought I could fix things quietly, cleanly. We were trying to raise property values, get ahead of the next development wave. The Riverwalk was supposed to be a symbol. I raised an eyebrow. Of what? He looked down. Control, I guess, progress. I folded my arms. You use that word like it means something. But all you built was an illusion, and you buried people's trust under it. He nodded slowly. You were right about everything. I wish I'd listened. You did listen, I said. You just didn't care. He swallowed, jaw tight, then turned and walked away. And I let him. Because I wasn't his judge. I was the man who lived on the edge of the river. The man they tried to shut up. The man they tried to drown out. But the river had spoken louder. And now so had I. The flood left scars, but it also washed things clean. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood looked like something between a war zone and a construction site. Yellow tape flapped like prayer flags across fences that had collapsed. Dumpsters lined the roads, filled with drywall, waterlogged furniture, and shattered dreams of designer renovations. The river, though, had returned to its original path, as if the land itself had sighed in relief, and the HOA was dead. Not officially, not yet. Bureaucracy doesn't die in a day, but the board resigned en masse within 2 weeks. Karen was gone. Greg had disappeared from public life. The official email account bounced back every message, and without leadership, dues stopped being collected. Enforcement stopped being enforced, and meetings became quiet affairs of apology and reconstruction. The state moved quickly. The water board filed formal environmental violation charges. County inspectors opened up a probe into illegal grading and structural negligence. And then the big one came. A class action lawsuit filed on behalf of 37 homeowners whose properties had been damaged or destroyed due to the HOA's unpermitted river diversion. My footage, my reports, my maps, and they formed the spine of the complaint. But I didn't join the suit. I'd done what I came to do. I protected my land. I told the truth. And when it mattered most, I showed up for my neighbors, even the ones who'd once looked at me like I didn't belong. Instead, I turned my focus to the community that had emerged from the wreckage. Rachel Ever, the organizer, launched something called Silverback Neighbors United. No dues, no fines. No committees. Just residents volunteering their skills and time to rebuild, support, and protect one another. I helped them grade the land behind the damaged townhomes, installing proper drainage. This time we dug trenches not to divert nature, but to understand it. We replanted willow trees. We let the river breathe, and still people kept showing up at my door. Some wanted to thank me. Others wanted advice. A single mom from 3 streets over knocked one morning and asked if I'd help her build a sandbag training plan for next year's runoff. A teenager brought me a drone part he'd 3D printed after watching my footage go viral online. An elderly man with a limp brought me a stack of old floodplain maps and said, I always knew that trench was trouble, but they told me to mind my business. I smiled. You're my kind of neighbor. Eventually, the city held a town hall. It was packed, not in the way HOA meetings had been, where people sat stiffly counting the minutes until they could leave, but with energy, with focus, with intent. A representative from the county stood at the front and cleared his throat. Silverback Ridge will no longer be governed by its former HOA board. The association is effectively dissolved pending completion of legal and environmental proceedings. Cheers erupted, but then he added something that made the room go quiet again. Moving forward, a transitional advisory council will be appointed. Residents, volunteers to guide the reconstruction effort, coordinate with emergency services, and oversee infrastructure planning. We've received several nominations for this council. I knew what was coming before he said it, and unanimously one name has been requested again and again, Daniel Dwyer. I didn't stand, didn't wave. I just sat there as the crowd turned and looked toward me. Rachel leaned over and whispered, "You can say no." I didn't. Because saying yes wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. About standing between people and the systems that forget to see them as people. About holding a line that no one else wants to hold until it's too late. And maybe about finding peace, not in solitude, but in purpose. I took the position, not forever, just long enough to see us through. One of my first acts was recommending a full environmental audit of the surrounding terrain. We brought in hydrologists from the state, consulted with geologists, and even created a shared map system where residents could see exactly where storm paths and runoff channels flowed. No more secrets. No more visionary projects built on hope and arrogance. Greg never came back. Karen, I heard, took a job in another state, far from rivers, far from me. Good. They weren't my concern anymore. What mattered was the family who built a raised garden bed where their flooded patio used to be, the elderly couple who turned their damaged basement into a shared workshop, the kids who now biked freely along the real river trail. No fake concrete paths, no crushed saplings. Just the land, raw and true and respected. One evening, long after the storm, I walked to the bank of the river alone. It was quiet again. Not the false quiet of denial, not the heavy silence before disaster, but the true peaceful hush of something restored. I sat on a large rock at the bend where the heron had returned. The water moved steadily, rhythmically, just as it had before. A neighbor passed by, waved. "Evening, Dan." I nodded. "Evening." He looked out across the river. Hard to believe what it looked like a few months ago. I smiled faintly. The river remembers. He didn't ask what I meant. He just stood there beside me, listening. And for once, I didn't feel like I was guarding the land. I felt like it was finally guarding us. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes after a long fight. It's not the silence of defeat or victory. It's something more sacred than that. A breath you didn't know you were holding. A release so deep it echoes in the bones. That's what I felt in the weeks after the last contractor packed up. The final insurance checks were cut, and the news vans turned their cameras toward the next disaster. Peace had returned, but not the same peace I'd known before the HOA tried to rewrite the river. This peace was earned. I walked the banks every morning, not out of fear, not out of suspicion, but out of respect, the way a soldier does when revisiting a battlefield-turned garden. The land had shifted subtly, the floodwaters having carved new veins into the soil. Trees leaned differently, rocks sat in unfamiliar patterns, but the river itself, its song, its rhythm, was right again, unforced, free. The barn was empty now, though its walls still smelled faintly of wet pine and propane. I'd kept a corner of it reserved, turned into a small exhibit of sorts, photos from the storm, news articles, the drone controller I'd used to record it all. Visitors came sometimes, curious neighbors, city officials, even a few high school students who asked for interviews for their environmental science project. One of them, a girl named Lonnie, asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you think it would have turned out the same if you hadn't lived here?" I looked out the barn window, the same one I'd once looked through while the water rose, and thought for a long while. "No," I said. "The river would have still risen. But it wouldn't have had a witness, because that's what saved us in the end. Not the permits, not the lawsuits, not the cameras. It was witnessing, refusing to look away when something wrong was dressed up to look right. Calling it out even when it made you a target, especially when it made you a target. They tried to isolate me, fine me, humiliate me. But the river didn't care about fines, and neither did the truth. Eventually, the state closed its investigation. The findings were conclusive and damning. Unauthorized diversion of a natural waterway, failure to obtain permits, endangerment of public safety, misuse of HOA funds. Civil penalties were issued. The former board members faced personal liability for damages, and at least one lawsuit reached settlement before trial. But I didn't attend the hearings. I was in the garden behind my house, coaxing life back into a patch of soil where the river's overflow had once gouged a hole big enough to swallow a shed. Funny thing, nature, even in destruction, it plants something. Neighbors came by more often now. They didn't just wave, they stayed. Some brought pie. Others brought